They don't find you. You have to be lost first. I was 24, a doctoral student in theology, so lost in old books I barely remembered my own name. I believed history was a clean line, a story written by God, preserved by the faithful. I saw the church as a fortress of truth. I didn't know it was also a prison. The invitation came on paper so old it felt like skin. It wasn't an offer, but a summons. An ancient Benedictine monastery with deep ties to the Vatican's archival offices needed a junior cataloger for a temporary project. It was a place that didn't appear on maps, a whisper among academics. For me, it was like being asked to step inside the mind of God. I arrived on a cold autumn morning. The walls were high and gray, the silence inside them thicker than stone. My life became a rhythm of bells, prayers, and ink-stained fingers. Brother Antoine, the elderly abbot, greeted me with eyes that held a quiet, settled sadness. He told me my work was a sacred duty, to bring order to a collection of unsorted manuscripts from the early centuries of the Church. He said it was about preservation, a quiet lie told with a pious smile. The first weeks were what I expected. I lived in a small, cold cell. I ate simple meals in silence. I worked in a scriptorium where the only sound was the scratching of pens and the turning of brittle pages. The monks were kind, devout men. Their faces were calm, their hands calloused from work and prayer. They moved with a purpose that felt ancient, holy. I saw faith. I saw devotion. I didn't see the fear. Not yet. My work was in the upper library, a beautiful room with vaulted ceilings and the sweet, dusty smell of decaying paper. But my access was limited. Certain wings were kept locked. When I asked Brother Michael, the head librarian, what was kept there, he just smiled. Writings that require a quieter mind to interpret. It was the first hint that knowledge here was stratified, that some truths were holier than others. One evening, a young novice, barely 18, saw me studying a 4th century Coptic text. He paled. "You should be careful with the old tongues," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Some words, they don't like being woken up." I laughed it off as superstition. A boy raised on ghost stories and incense. I didn't know he was giving me a warning. The facade began to crack during a storm. A leak in the roof forced us to move a section of books from a little-used alcove. Behind a heavy oak shelf, we found a door. It wasn't on any of the library blueprints. It was bound in iron with no keyhole, just a small, intricate seal I didn't recognize. Brother Michael went rigid. He ordered us away, his usual gentle demeanor gone, replaced by a cold, sharp authority. He and the abbot entered the room alone and emerged hours later, their faces pale. The door was sealed with fresh mortar the next morning. Nothing was said. We were expected to forget what we saw, to unknow it. That's when I understood. This place wasn't just a library. It was a tomb, a place where ideas were sent not to be preserved, but to be buried. And I was sleeping on top of the graveyard. He didn't lead me to the abbot's office for punishment. He led me down toward something far worse. The truth. The old monk, Brother Thomas, gripped my arm, his silence more commanding than any shout. We passed the archives, then the wine cellars, stopping before a tapestry of the crucifixion. He pulled it aside, revealing not stone, but a narrow passage spiraling down into the black. "Do not speak from this moment on," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Only watch, and pray your God does not watch with you." The air grew cold as we descended, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. It was the smell of contained energy. He guided me to a small, hidden ledge overlooking a circular chamber carved from the bedrock. It was lit by a single, thick candle in the center, but its flame was unnaturally still, a perfect teardrop of light that didn't flicker or dance. Below, 5 of the oldest monks stood in a circle, their faces hidden by the deep hoods of their cloaks. These were not their simple brown Benedictine robes. They were made of a dark, heavy wool, almost black, and embroidered with a symbol that made my blood run cold. It was the serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros from the Forbidden Book. but inside its circle was a small, severe cross, a fusion of pagan magic and Christian authority. This was not worship. This was an operation. In the center of the chamber, right beside the candle, sat a small, black stone tablet that seemed to drink the light from the room. It was perfectly smooth, without reflection, a piece of captured night. Then the abbot began to chant. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't Greek or Coptic. It was the sound I now believe the serpent in Eden must have made. A rhythmic, guttural series of vibrations that resonated not in my ears, but in my bones. The very stone beneath my fingers seemed to hum with it. It was a language designed to speak not to a god, but to the world itself. It was a command. As the chant deepened, the air grew thick, pressing in on me, making each breath a conscious effort. I felt a wave of vertigo, a terrifying sensation of falling forward into the darkness. Brother Thomas's hand clamped down on my shoulder, a silent anchor. "Do not listen to the words," he breathed into my ear, his voice barely disturbing the air. "Listen to the silence between them. That is where it moves." I watched, mesmerized with horror, as the candle flame slowly elongated, stretching upward and turning a deep, sickly blue. Then I saw him. Brother Benedictus, a frail man of 90, began to tremble violently. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and a voice came out. But it wasn't his. It was a chorus of voices, layered, ancient, genderless, speaking in that same impossible tongue. It was as if they were pouring something into him, or pulling something out. The abbot raised his hands, and the voice cut off with a sickening snap. Benedictus collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, caught by the others before he hit the floor. The ritual was over. They carried his limp body out of the chamber. I didn't see him again for 3 days. When he finally reappeared for morning prayers, the change was staggering. The palsied tremor in his hands was gone. His cloudy, cataract-filled eyes were clear and sharp. He looked 10 years younger. They hadn't been praying for him. They had been recharging him. They had used a forbidden, ancient rite to pour life back into a failing body. That's when I finally understood. The monastery's endless piety wasn't just devotion. It was a shield. The rigid schedules, the constant prayers, the vows of silence. They were a cage of spiritual discipline, built to contain the incredible, terrifying power they were wielding in the dark. They were afraid of the very force they were using. They weren't just monks. They were jailers, and the prison was their own souls. The power in the crypt had a title. They called it the containment. I learned its true name from the man it was breaking apart, piece by piece. His name was Brother Luca, the keeper of the vault. It was not a position of honor. It was a life sentence. His only duty was to maintain the exterior of the iron door in the catacombs, to burn the incense, to paint the strange saline mixture along its seal, and to listen to the silence on the other side. He was a sentinel guarding a wound, and the infection was seeping through the stone. I sought him out in the monastery gardens, a place of vibrant life that seemed to mock the decay that clung to him. He was a man hollowed out by his duty, his eyes wide and perpetually startled, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be seen by something that wasn't there. At first, he refused to speak of it, but 40 years of terrified silence had worn him down. He was a dam about to burst. "It isn't a reliquary," he finally whispered one afternoon, his hands trembling as he pruned a rose bush. "It's a collection. Things that were confiscated, seized, things that couldn't be burned." He spoke of artifacts taken from Egypt during secret Jesuit missions, brought back not as trophies, but as threats to be imprisoned. "How do you kill a thought?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How do you burn a memory?" He described what the old logs called them. A mirror from a priestess of Isis that showed not your reflection, but the face of the one who would cause your death. A set of black stone tablets covered in glyphs that pulsed with a soft, golden light during the dark of the moon, and a vial of oil from a forgotten pharaoh's tomb that was said to be a key, a conduit to a power older than the church, older than the world. Over the next few weeks, I watched him crumble. The vault was a living predator, and it was feeding on him. He stopped sleeping, claiming he heard whispers from the door at night. Not words, but rhythms, like a slow, deep heartbeat. During the day, he would wander the cloisters, scratching symbols in the dirt with a stick. I recognized one of them from the Forbidden Codex. The Eye of Horus, drawn over and over, a frantic prayer to a god he was supposed to condemn. He grew thin, pale, as if the color was being drained from him, leached away by the proximity to that suffocating darkness. The other monks began to avoid him. They saw his terror not as an illness to be treated, but as a contamination to be shunned. He was a walking warning. The last time I saw him alive, he cornered me in the passage leading from the chapel. He grabbed my arm, his grip like an iron band. His eyes were wild with a sanity-shattering fear. "It knows my name," he rasped, his breath hot and foul. "It spoke it. From the other side of the door. Followed me. It's in my room. It waits in the mirror when I'm not looking." He pushed his face close to mine, his voice dropping to a terrified hiss. "They don't contain it. They feed it. The chants, the rituals, they're not keeping it in. They're keeping it alive. You have to leave." The next morning, his cell was empty. The window, barred with iron, was undisturbed. They said his mind had finally broken, that he had run away in a crisis of faith. Brother Antoine led a prayer for his lost soul. But I went to his cell before they sealed it. The room was cold, unnaturally so. And on the stone floor, drawn with perfect precision in a pile of gray ash, was a single symbol, a star with 5 points. I knew he hadn't run. He had been taken. The vault had reached out and pulled him into its silence. And his warning was no longer a story. It was a prophecy. I had been shown the prison. I had witnessed the ritual. Now I had seen the victim, and I knew if I didn't find the whole truth, I would be next. Brother Luca's ghost left me 2 gifts. The first was his terror. The second was my rage. And rage is a key that opens any door, even those locked by God. His disappearance was not a warning that sent me fleeing. It was a mandate. I could no longer just watch. I had to know what truth was worth a man's soul. I waited until the bells called the monks to the longest of their nightly prayers, a 2-hour vigil of chants and silence. The abbot's study was on the 2nd floor, its door made of ancient, unforgiving oak. But Luca's fear had shown me the monastery's secret. Every holy thing here had a second, hidden purpose. The lock was a simple thing, meant to deter the curious. The true security was our own faith, and I had just lost mine. Behind a heavy tapestry depicting Saint Benedict resisting temptation, I found what I knew must be there. A false panel in the wall. It opened with a soft click into a space that was the antithesis of the grand library. It was a small, cold, sterile room lined with shelves of black, leather-bound ledgers. This wasn't an archive of faith. It was an intelligence office. The air smelled of old paper and the cold, metallic scent of a secret kept too long. Here I found them, the logs of the keepers of the vault dating back 300 years. I opened the most recent volume. It was filled with Luca's spidery, terrified handwriting, documenting the whispers, the cold spots, the oppressive presence. But the older entries, written in firm, scholarly script, were far more terrifying. They spoke not of fear, but of results. An entry from 1812 described how the glowing Egyptian tablets were used in a ritual that healed a visiting bishop from a fatal plague. Another mentioned the black stone from the crypt, calling it a map of echoes used for scrying. They had a name for it, liturgical engineering. They were using the raw, contained power of these forbidden artifacts, channeling it through their Christian rituals to produce miracles on demand. The entire monastery was a laboratory, and the monks were the scientists. Then, tucked into the back of a ledger from the 17th century, I found a letter, sealed with the unbroken wax of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was from an inquisitor stationed in Cairo, written to the abbot of this monastery. His words burned the lie of my life to the ground. The Egyptian priests were not idolaters, he wrote. They were technicians of the soul. Their concept of Heka is not superstition, but a terrifyingly real science, the force that shapes reality, activated through spoken words and intention. To allow humanity this direct access to the divine is to render the Church obsolete. Our authority rests upon their ignorance and their need for an intermediary. We must hold the monopoly on the divine. That was it. The truth. The great, dark secret of the Church wasn't devil worship or a hidden heresy. It was the cold, calculated, systematic suppression of human potential. For 2,000 years, they had been scavengers, hunting down every other path to the divine, every other system of power, and locking them away. They buried scrolls, burned libraries, and demonized knowledge, all to protect their franchise. They didn't fear that the old magic was evil. They feared it was real. They feared it worked. And buried deep in their institutional heart, they feared it worked better than their own faith. I felt a cold wave of nausea. Every prayer I had ever uttered, every sacrament I had ever taken, now felt like a hollow echo of a stolen, more powerful truth. I was a child who had been told a comforting fairy tale, while my parents kept the real, electrifying story locked in the attic. I couldn't take the ledger, but I needed proof. My eyes fell on a page in Luca's log. It detailed the ritual associated with the five-pointed star, the one drawn in his cell. It was a rite of soul transference, meant to move a spirit from one vessel to another. They hadn't just driven him mad. They had used him. With shaking hands, I copied the diagram and the incantation onto a scrap of paper from my pocket. It was proof. It was a death sentence. I placed the ledger back on the shelf and slipped out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had the truth. Now I just had to survive leaving the prison. In a fortress of absolute obedience, the greatest sin is not to doubt. It's to leave. To take a secret with you is to declare war on their silence, and they are masters of war. My discovery in the abbot's study was a silent alarm. The moment I stepped out of that hidden room, the very air in the monastery shifted. The monks I passed in the halls no longer had pious, downcast eyes. Their gazes were sharp, cold, and assessing. They knew. I was no longer a brother scholar. I was a vessel of forbidden knowledge, and they were the exorcists. My only way out was the path Luca had started for me. His cell. The loose stones behind the window bars. It was a desperate hope, a dead man's last effort. As I worked in the darkness, prying at the last of the mortar, I heard it. It started as a low hum, vibrating up through the floor, the chant from the crypt. But this time it wasn't for a ritual. It was for me. It was a weapon. The frequency seeped into the room, a sound that unraveled thought, designed to induce confusion, terror, and paralysis. My mind grew foggy, my hands clumsy. Images flashed behind my eyes. Falling stars, whispers in a language of sand and wind. They were trying to break me from a distance, to pacify me into submission before they even opened the door. Luca's rage was the only thing that kept me focused. I squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough stone cutting my hands and face, and dropped into the cold, damp air of the monastery garden. I ran. I didn't look back, but I could feel their silence chasing me, a presence far more terrifying than any sound. I have been running ever since. I've moved 3 times in the last year. I work dead-end jobs for cash. I don't use my real name. I am a ghost, haunted by the memory of what I saw and hunted by the men I left behind. All I have is the single page I copied from Luca's log. The paper is brittle, the ink faded, but the words are still alive. It describes a ritual of stolen life, a form of spiritual surgery, a power the world has forgotten, a power the Vatican has kept for itself. They erased this knowledge from our history, labeling it heresy and witchcraft. They twisted the gods of Egypt into demons, its science into superstition, its wisdom into a threat to the soul. They built an empire on a story of a single path to salvation, while secretly studying all the other paths they had buried. They taught us to fear our own power, to believe that divinity was something outside of us, a gift to be earned from a distant heaven rather than a birthright to be remembered in our own blood and breath. They did this not because they were holy, but because they understood control, the kind that can't be ruled. If you can speak to the divine yourself, what use have you for a priest? If you can heal with your own intention, who needs a miracle? If your soul holds a power older than any institution, who needs a church to feel whole? That is the question that has echoed in their sealed vaults for centuries. That is why they burned the scrolls and rewrote the past. Freedom, in the way the Egyptians understood it, was not political, it was spiritual. It meant your soul was unbound. It meant you could hold light. It meant you could not be kept small. And that scared them more than any demon. So they built their fortress of faith on top of a graveyard of forgotten truth, and they hoped no one would ever dig. But memory has a way of returning. The truth was never destroyed, only silenced. I am breaking that silence now. But this story is not about me. It's about the truth they tried to bury inside all of us. The real question is not what dark practices I saw inside that monastery. The real question is, what have they forced you to forget? You think the story ends when the prisoner escapes the dungeon. That was my mistake, too. I thought freeing the truth was the final act. But the truth, once freed, doesn't just want to be known. It wants to be remembered. And the prison I escaped wasn't made of stone walls. It was made of forgetting. The war didn't end the night I ran. It simply followed me out into the world. After months of living in the shadows, I did the only thing I could. I took the page I copied from Luca's log, the diagram of the soul-stealing ritual, and I gave it to the void. I scanned it, encrypted it, and released it onto the darkest corners of the web with a simple and signed message. They didn't save us from the old magic. They stole it from us. The first reaction was silence. Then ridicule. It was dismissed as a conspiracy theory, a hoax, a creative fiction. The machinery of disbelief, so carefully built over centuries, did its job. But the truth is not a virus that needs to infect everyone. It's a seed. It only needs the right soil. And in the quiet corners of the world, it began to grow. It appeared in forums dedicated to esoteric texts, on the laptops of forgotten historians, in the private messages of people who had always felt that something was missing from the story we'd been told. They recognized the symbols. They understood the implications. They didn't need to be convinced. They only needed to be reminded. The Vatican's response was not a papal bull or a sermon from a balcony. The modern Inquisition doesn't wear robes. It writes code. They deployed what I can only describe as digital silencers. Armies of bots flooded forums to label the information as dangerous heresy. Sophisticated algorithms were used to bury search results. My original post was wiped, but not before it had been copied 1,000 times. They were playing a game of digital whack-a-mole, but the idea was already loose. They couldn't burn a library that now existed in 1 million scattered hard drives. They couldn't excommunicate a heretic with no name. They had lost the one thing that gave them power, control over the narrative. Then, the echoes began. Stranger things started to happen, things that had nothing to do with me. An art student in Brazil with no knowledge of Egyptology began painting canvases filled with perfect hieroglyphs she saw in her dreams. A sound engineer in Tokyo discovered a strange, low-frequency hum embedded in recordings of empty cathedrals. A frequency that matched the rhythm of the chant I heard in the crypt. People started talking about a shared dream, a collective vision of a temple with a broken mirror. The seed I had planted was not the only one. It was merely the water that woke up the seeds that were already there, dormant in our collective soul. An ancient memory was beginning to surface. The power the monks had kept locked in their vault was not an artifact to be owned, but a potential waiting to be realized. I am still a ghost, still moving from city to city, but I am no longer just running from something. I am the keeper of a warning. The page I carry is not a weapon. It's a reminder that the divine is not a story to be told by a priest, but a force to be experienced. It's the hum in your bones in a silent room, the strange pull of a forgotten symbol, the feeling that the words you speak carry more weight than you know. The church was right to be afraid. Not of gods or demons, but of us. Of a humanity that remembers it doesn't need a shepherd, because it was never a flock of sheep. It was a pride of lions that had simply been taught to forget the sun. They can't stop this. They can't put the memory back in the vault. A great forgetting is ending. A new awakening has begun.